Love podcasts, hate nonsense. It's the PoliticsJOE podcast, ladies and gentlemen.
Well done.
The first time I've done it, where I've done it in one.
First take.
Laura Beveridge. Happy Monday.
Happy Monday, Seán Hickey. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Well, I've had better days. I was just saying I'm not sure if my flat has mold in it and it's given me a very tight chest. But or maybe it's the change of season.
Yeah, well, I am totally blocked up with hay fever. So we're going to sound great for the listener.
Yeah. Velvety.
Huge weekend of news.
A massive weekend. News has been happening for days on end.
It never stops.
No. And I mean, at the time of year where, well, Jesus is preparing for his Last Supper. Mm-hmm. He's also preparing for his crucifixion.
Yeah. He didn't give up news for Lent.
He didn't give up news. He certainly didn't. Well, we certainly didn't anyway. Nationalisation is back on the menu.
Sure is. Parliament was recalled on Saturday, which is very unusual, to pass an emergency piece of legislation called the Steel Industry Special Measures Bill. And this has been to do with what Ava's been covering a lot on our channel, which is the closure of Scunthorpe. Should I give a little rundown of kind of where we're at and what happened this weekend? Yeah. So basically, the government is now in control of British Steel. It's now sitting on the board directing the blast furnaces to stay open, making sure that they're ordering enough raw materials, which is the coal, to do that. And this happened because, Jinye remains the shareholder though, even, so it's not full nationalisation.
They still own the site.
They still own the site. This happened after negotiations between the government and Jinye appeared to break down. Jonathan Reynolds, the Business and Trade Secretary, accused Jinye of failing to negotiate in good faith after it decided to stop buying enough raw materials to keep the blast furnaces open. And Reynolds even said that the British government offered to purchase the raw materials for Jinye, but Jinye didn't accept that offer. So Parliament was recalled and the legislation was passed unopposed. And yeah, I guess that's kind of where we're at. Should we hear Jonathan Reynolds say that in his own words in reply to Richard Tice's question?
Yeah, let's roll the clip.
Given that the Secretary of State has inferred that actually the owners, Jinye, are not acting and have not acted in good faith, surely the right thing to do is to seize this great opportunity now, this weekend, and nationalise British Steel.
Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear that a transfer of ownership to the state remains on the table. And it may well, at this stage, given the behaviour of the company, be the likely option. But also, our aspirations for British Steel remain a co-investment agreement with a private sector partner to secure that long-term transformation. The action I seek to take today is not a magic wand or a panacea. The state cannot fund the long-term transformation of British Steel itself, nor would it want to do so. But a failure to act today would prevent any more desirable outcome from even being considered. And that is, again, why we must act today.
It's interesting when the populist right is calling for full nationalisation and you get a hint of, well, maybe we'll do that at some point from the centre-left, centre-right government.
It's interesting because it isn't full nationalisation, even though Reynolds, Starmer, they're not ruling it out. They keep saying that it's on the table. It's a likely thing that might happen, but they're saying that their preferred option is still to find a private partner to co-invest, because it's not just that they need to keep the site running, it's that there's quite a lot of investment needed for modernisation, which Jinye promised back at the time when it was sold to them under Boris Johnson, but never really delivered. It's interesting what you were saying about how reform's role in this, because Nigel Farage was on Laura Kuenssberg taking quite a lot of credit for this. And he said that perhaps if himself and Richard Tice hadn't gone down to Scunthorpe last week, that Labour never would have done this. Which, do you think there's any truth to that?
No. I think what reform being there did was to outflank Labour on what would traditionally be seen as a Labour issue. If Labour were not in government, Keir Starmer would have been down there all last week. Or certainly somebody from the shadow front bench. It is really peculiar to have a quasi-socialist government, or certainly a government that is of a party that comes from socialist worker values, to then have this kind of fear to nationalize something that's being essentially offered to you on a plate. Like, I think in the debate as well, Reynolds says in a couple of questions that what pushed the book to implement these measures was actually that the government didn't have to pay anything to get into this position at British Steel in the first place. If you were being a trot about it, you wouldn't have to pay for any of the industries if you wanted to reappropriate them, you know. Like, I mean, the thing with Tata as well. Yes, okay, sure. There was already a deal negotiated with the Conservative government by the time that the blast furnaces were shut, but you could still take radical measures if you wanted to. There was just no appetite to do so, and I think it's strange to, at this point, have the government recognizing that we probably will have to fully nationalise this in the weeks and months to come. But we're not going to do it now. And we're going to do this dance for the next couple of weeks, next couple of months, to try and get somebody to co-invest with us. And I can appreciate, like, the to avoid any sort of counters from the Conservatives on, like, well, you're just being a Stalinist regime by seizing this property. I can understand why you would want to keep the market open for something like that. But if it's not apparent now, you should just take it back into full public ownership. And I mean, I think there was numbers being bandied about of, was it 250 million or 350
annual
million?
net losses, 233 million per year.
Yeah. And I think when Ginier took it over, it was £700,000 a day that Scunthorpe was losing, right? So that's another reason you can kind of, I guess, defend Labour of not wanting to take full liability for it. On a very surface level, economic responsibility, like we're physically conservative, we're fiscally responsible, but still it just seems like you've been given an open goal and Reform have kind of taken it away from you and allowed themselves to be the ones to say, we're responsible for your change of heart on this, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely was the kind of opposition line that was on the media rounds this weekend. It was, well, how much is this going to cost the taxpayer? How much would full nationalisation cost the taxpayer? And I feel like Jonathan Reynolds actually had quite a good answer to this, which was, well, how much would it cost the taxpayer to let this industry go completely bust? We'd have, 2,700 job losses and then the knock-on job losses in Scunthorpe as well. And he was saying that's what we could have been sitting here talking about this weekend, but we're not. And that also he was saying that there's money put aside already in the budget in the steel fund. So he was saying that if they do manage to get a co-investor soon, that there won't actually be any losses financially. But that was definitely the attack line that we saw coming in. But I think that, do you think that anyone was sitting watching that thinking that Labour have made the wrong decision here?
No, I don't think so. I think the only thing that you could criticise them for is the method in which they've done it. Like, why did it need to be Friday afternoon that you decided, actually, we're going to go in on Saturday and push this through? Why couldn't it have been much earlier on in the week? And I appreciate that, like, okay, you're at the negotiating table with Ginier up until Friday. But if they're not playing ball, again, you are not a business negotiator in a arrangement like that. You are the government of the country where this critical infrastructure exists. There is no kind of like, if they're not playing ball, as Jonathan Reynolds was saying on Saturday, you need to just cut ties immediately and say, okay, we're going to start putting in legislation where because that's the thing I find bizarre about it all as well. You mentioned in your rundown that the government is going to be at the table now for kind of the everyday logistics and operations of the Scunthorpe plant. But it's Jonathan Reynolds himself who's responsible.
Yeah, making sure they get their wages paid.
It's insane. Like, I'm sure eventually there's probably going to be a minister for steel or something like that.
Reynolds is doing the payroll every week.
Yeah, like, does he not have enough to be doing before? Like, you've got like the tariffs coming in 3 months' time, and like
he's
the business and trade
man.
secretary is like, poor guy.
It's interesting because he said that the market value of British steel is effectively nothing, but that it is such a key strategic industry, especially at this time in world politics. So it totally makes sense that the government should step in, not for commercial reasons, but for strategic defence, national security reasons. And I think that's one of the things that's raised a lot of interesting domestic questions from this, is that if the government has stepped in over Scunthorpe, does that then set a precedent for nationalisation of other industries that are on the rocks in the UK? Obviously, Stephen Flynn was quite angry about Grangemouth. Shall we hear him here?
Let's hear Flynn.
State for giving way. He's made a reference to unique and exceptional and energy transitions, thousands of jobs. In the Scottish context, many minds right now will be very much focused on the situation in Grangemouth, where we know that hundreds of jobs are going to be lost directly, thousands of jobs in the supply chain. Now, were I, or perhaps even the local member for Alloa and Grangemouth, to bring forward a similar bill in respect of Scotland's only oil refinery, to save it, to give him the executive power to do as he pleases, as he is doing with British Steel, would the Labour Party back it in the same way as it is backing this bill today?
Well, I'm pleased for the chance, Mr. Speaker, to address this particular issue. The importance of Grangemouth is why this Labour government has pledged £200 million to secure its long-term future. And it is an important asset. It is not the only remaining. It's one of 3 crackers in the United Kingdom. That's important. But specifically, it is not a comparable situation. And the behaviour of the company is not comparable to the situation in this case.
But Reynolds' response to that was kind of, steel isn't a sunset industry. Steel is actually really key to a green transition. Whereas maybe he would think something like an oil refinery is something that we should actually be phasing out.
Yeah, look, there are pros and cons to phasing out any industry, and obviously, but I think as well with the steel, right? You've got this kind of Port Talbot is probably the best one to have a comparison with, where rather than having this slow transition and slow kind of overlapping of sustainable steel and non-sustainable steel production, you have the shutting down of what is considered to be the climate unfriendly practice at the plant at the expense of thousands of jobs, all in the sake of, well, in 10, 15, 20 years' time, we're going to be a green energy steel producer. I think there's something to be said, especially when it comes to Grangemouth as well, of things like reskilling and upskilling people who are in an industry that is dying. Or, I mean, I don't think oil production is dying at all. Like, look at any like petro-state in the Middle East.
Is
you know
that
what I mean?
we're importing, we're not actually weaning ourselves off of this.
Exactly. So, I mean, like, it is, and I also think, like, it was quite poor taste from, like, in the question that Flynn had, to kind of try and tie it back into this thing of what we were saying there a second ago of like, yeah, okay, it might be a couple of thousand jobs at the plant, but the entire lifeblood of a community, or not just the neighbouring towns kilometres away from this site are going to suffer from this.
Yeah.
And to then make it, I think the guy immediately after Stephen Flynn was making an SMP, like a PMQ's kind of SMP thing of like, well, they've had so long in power in Scotland and they've never done a thing. Like,
but not the power to nationalise it.
Yeah, like they haven't got the power to and that's exactly the point that he makes. We'll just be ending up playing the entire debate if we just play clips the whole time. But Flynn did have a few minutes after the initial introduction of the bill where he was making the point that actually we do not have the power to make any changes when it comes to heavy industry like this in Scotland. So it isn't, I mean, politics isn't fair, but to take jabs at the SNP's record in Scotland because I'm raising a case for massive job losses in Scotland because of the actions of this government is quite cheap and quite unfair nearly, right?
And also the Labour MP for the area in Grangemouth has consistently called on the Labour government to nationalise it.
Yeah.
And that's been met with deaf ears.
Yeah.
So.
I think as well, like again, on the topic of Port Talbot, the thing that Jonathan Reynolds was talking about on Sunday of, well, we are actually saving money in the long term by keeping people in work. They're paying money into the exchequer. We're keeping the local economy secure, yada, yada, yada. I was thinking about, because myself and Ava were in Port Talbot last year to, I think it was 2 weeks before the furnaces shut down or the job losses came into effect.
Good piece if you haven't seen it on our YouTube channel.
Yeah, highly recommend it. Go and watch it. We spoke to a lot of people there that were not involved whatsoever in the steel manufacturing industry. But the terror, like it wasn't anger at the government shutting down an industry. It was kind of, I've seen what deindustrialization looks like.
Definitely.
That is coming to this town.
Yeah.
I don't know what life looks like for me anymore. And to then a year later have, obviously they're not going to spite people living in Scunthorpe, but to see how from one day to the next, the government can turn around and at the drop of a hat say, right, well, we're making these measures to make sure that this economy and this city and this industry stays afloat. You can go fuck yourself,
Definitely.
essentially.
And I think that is the scary thing that also in Grangemouth, it was the same thing, is that these industries are located in places that have been wiped out industrially. Like all the towns next to them have gone. In Grangemouth, you've like Longannet was gone, Ravenscraig's gone, and they can reel these places off, and they know them. They're the towns next to them, and they've seen what happened there. And to think that that's what's coming for their town next, and that the alternatives are to either take low-paid jobs in the town, which completely changes their lifestyle, or is to end up on welfare essentially, or to leave the town completely and leave your family and your kind of roots. And those are the three options that they're left with. I think those are the domestic questions that this has raised. I think there is also questions that seem to be on an international level as well about were we right to sell these key strategic industries off to foreign international companies. That was featuring very heavily on the media rounds. Shall we hear from Jonathan Reynolds on that when he was on Trevor Phillips?
A lot of UK Chinese trade is in non-contentious areas, agricultural products, life sciences, or automotive. It's not difficult. I think where as a country we've got it wrong in the past. You had a phase, I think the sort of David Cameron, George Osborne phase initially, it was far too naive about some of this. You had a phase, to be frank, under the Conservative government just before they lost office, where they wouldn't engage at all, and that was inappropriate. We're a real outlier. There was no political engagement. The US has some very assertive measures in place to China, but they do have political engagement. So I think the balance was wrong. I think you've got to be clear about what is the sort of sector where actually we can promote and cooperate, and ones, frankly, where we can't.
Okay.
I wouldn't personally bring a Chinese company into our steel sector.
You would not bring a Chinese
company? I wouldn't. I think steel is a very sensitive area. I don't know the Boris Johnson government when they did this, what exactly the situation was, but I think it's a sensitive area.
Sensitive areas? What about nuclear power, for example?
Look, I wouldn't want to, on an interview, make that kind of specific determination, but I think we can't ignore China. I mean, China's a fifth of the global economy. What they do has an impact on us. And where we can have areas where we can cooperate in our mutual interest, I think that is a good
But there's a high trust bar now, isn't there?
Yes. We've got to recognise that. And again, I don't want people to think that this particular situation is more than just the company itself. But, companies operate in different environments. And look, what we were offering to not have to recall Parliament in terms of the offer around raw materials, the British government making sure there'd be no losses if Xingye purchased those, actually then increasing the generosity of that offer. Any company, I think, operating in a sort of rational economic manner would say that we'll take that offer.
Yeah, I think that he is there echoing things that maybe we've seen more China hawkish MPs in the past, like Ian Duncan Smith, raise. Nigel Farage perhaps was engaging a bit disingenuously with this on Laura Kuenssberg as well, saying that, well, alleging quite libelously possibly that they had intentionally bought this industry to close it down, and again was playing this kind of protectionist, Trump-esque rhetoric about industry in relations to China. Speaking of, I saw something really interesting, or have been seeing something really interesting on TikTok regarding Chinese manufacturing and the Trump tariffs. I don't know if you've seen it.
The AI slop videos of Americans making the things the Chinese people
No,
make.
but those are funny. No, it was basically all the manufacturers that manufacture for big American brands like Zara or it's not an American brand, but like big international brands that are being affected by these tariffs, are now like showing the inside of the factories and being like, look, this is how much we manufacture it for. It's so cheap to buy if you buy directly from the Chinese manufacturing companies, but you're getting upsold at this really high price when you're buying it in American retailers. And they're doing like exposing videos, but they're all over my TikTok, and it's only recently appeared. And I was like, this is so interesting on an app that is also a Chinese-owned firm.
Yeah. Well, they're going to just put a shop front in every sweatshop in China now
well,
to sell direct from there.
That's what I was also thinking. I was like, wow, these factories, they look very nice inside. Their workers look very happy to be there.
Yeah. I wonder if they were selected especially for this. But no, China is going to be the foremost power in the world in, I think, is it the 50-year plan that they had, or the 100-year plan, where the Chinese Communist Party's goal for 2100 was to be the world's foremost power, replace America as it. I think
they might meet that goal early.
Well, they've revised their target to like 2050. Like, they could not. I think there's a guy. He might be an economics advisor in the CCP, who wrote a book in the 1990s about China. It's called China's Century, and the book is essentially mapping out how China will become the world's foremost power, and it kind of maps predictably how things would happen, but it doesn't predict things like Donald Trump. It doesn't predict things like, I'm not saying Brexit was one of the most significant events.
Like external shocks.
Exactly. Not predicting these things, but still being on the trajectory to be the world's foremost power. Now getting to a point where the West, when it comes... At that point is kind of half-baked, I suppose. It's quite interesting how we ourselves have gotten ourselves into the place where we are paving the way for Chinese domination. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is for somebody else to say. But I find it super interesting how the debate around particularly
Steel?
Yes. Xingye has been that they have purposely bought this industry to run it down, to destroy British steel manufacturing, to destroy this, to destroy that. Whether that be true or not, can you trust any other country with your critical national infrastructure and to guarantee that the jobs of some of the quote-unquote left-behind communities of your country are going to be looked after by a foreign company, whether it's a foreign company or a foreign country? They don't have the same vested interest as you. So it doesn't matter if it's China. It doesn't matter if it's India. It doesn't matter if it's
the
Italy
US.
or the US. Or they only have a bottom line in mind. Like, I mean, particularly when it comes to Scunthorpe, Tata used to own it. and sold it for £1 to the gang that owned it before it was put into public ownership briefly before it was sold.
Special
to
administration measures. Yeah.
So I mean, with this whole debate about Xinye, it's kind of, I think it'd be useful to remember that Tata had that site and saw that they weren't profiting from it. I'm not saying that it will never be profitable. You can certainly make it profitable. You can certainly up production on the site. But point being, Tata didn't have the intention to do it, sold it for £1 to somebody else who then had whatever interest they had. But Tata have kind of been held up as this comparison to Xinye of like, well, Tata understand what it means to do business in Britain. Do they really? They've just sacked thousands of people in Wales, you know?
Yeah, it's quite me reaping, me sowing me reaping energy that they, you know, we're happy to take advantage when in a global race to the bottom for cheaper labor prices and cheaper consumer prices. But now we're reaping the costs of that.
Yeah.
And like you said, whether it is China or the US, because I mean, Ava did the interview with Angus Hanton on Vassal State, which is about how US private equity owns essentially everything in this country. Even things that you think of as being British or British made are actually at the top owned by American private equity. And then in return, that absolute impact and influence that the US has over British politics. But the way we talk about China, like it's this outlier with sinister influence over the UK. It's no more sinister than the US and no more influential than the US, but the way that we talk about it is incredibly different.
Yeah. I mean, it was kind of there was another line that Reynolds had when he was introducing the bill where it was the claim that Britain is a global superpower. Whether it was in terms of steel or whether it was terms in just generally being a superpower. And what it made me think, what does being a superpower mean in the 21st century? Does it mean that you were once a very important player in the world? Or does it mean something like what you're saying about America, of having your tentacles in every facet of every single country in the world and having everybody singing off your hymn sheet? Is it what China has been doing with the Belt and Road Initiative and by buying up things like the British steel plant or whatever it might be? I certainly believe that being a superpower isn't having your steel manufacturing owned by Indian and Chinese companies, by having your train systems owned by Deutsche Bahn or Trenitalia or SNCF, or having your water system owned by private equity, or having your nuclear arms owned by the Americans, essentially. None of these things make Britain great.
Definitely not.
And you can't turn around and say we're taking back some sort of autonomy and we're taking back some sort of. You've got a long way to go before you get to any phase of being a strong player in the world, given that everything is owned by somebody else. You know, like.
Should we wrap up chats with Scunthorpe there, or is there anything else you'd like to add?
I'm happy with that. Are you happy with that?
I am happy with that.
Well, listener, I hope you're happy with that, because we're going to pivot now to the Greens.
Woo! Who did back full nationalisation of Scunthorpe, interestingly, like Reform did.
Would you say that the Greens pushed Keir Starmer into the position that we find ourselves in now?
Well, if you view them as a populist alternative to Reform, which is perhaps how they would like to be viewed, as I learned this weekend. So there are local elections May 1st. And I think actually perhaps this round of local elections feels a bit more relevant, prominent than maybe local elections normally do, for a couple of reasons. The first being that the Birmingham bin strikes have been all over the news, and I think show just what happens when a council breaks down and how that actually has way more impacts on people's everyday lives than some of these huge national stories. Also, it's the first litmus test of Keir Starmer's government, because often these council elections are seen as a reaction to how the national government is doing, will influence how people vote locally. So the Tories have the most to lose this election, as they hold 20 of the 23 local authorities up for grabs. But I went to Dartford in Kent, where the Greens are out campaigning, and I spoke to Laura Eady, who is the candidate there, a Green candidate, and I went door knocking with her. And that piece,
campaigning for the Greens.
Well,
interesting.
I was filming it. But that piece will be out hopefully to view by the end of today. But I think what is really interesting about how some Green candidates and how some factions within the Green Party right now are trying to position themselves, which isn't as this kind of progressive, soft, net zero party that perhaps they have been viewed as for a very long time in this country, but they're perhaps trying to shift the image of them to something that's more hard left, socialist, populist even. And I spoke to Steve Jackson, who is the lead on local elections campaign and part of this faction called Greens Organise. And here's him on how the Greens want to take the fight to reform.
Unfortunately, there's a gang of grifters that have stepped into that void, Reform UK. A lot of old Tory voters are looking at Reform because they think it's the answer, and Reform are appealing to new people who are just sick of the establishment parties. I think what it says about the area is that it's somewhere that's been left behind, somewhere that people feel like they're not listened to, they're disenfranchised, they don't feel they've got a voice, they don't feel like things can get better, and that's why they're looking to shake up the political system. But we know the only way to actually shake up the political system is not by voting for a city boy backed by billionaires, it's by voting for strong, bold, local Green representation.
Are the Green Party the left-wing alternative to Reform?
So Greens Organise are running a campaign around the country that we're calling Taking the Fight to Reform. We recognise that millions of voters are angry at the political system, angry at the empty suits shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic, looking for something different. But we know that Reform UK are not something different. They are more of the same, if not worse, for ordinary working people. And the Green Party is the only party right now that it seems is standing up for people and standing up for the values that we all share.
So my question to you, Seán, is do you think the Greens need a new leader to be an effective left-wing opposition?
If it is the leadership that are in control of how the Green Party presents itself or how the Green Party is perceived by the general public, then quite possibly I'm not going to be the one to say that they need to get rid of them. But I think it's the interesting thing with the Green movement Europe-wide, and I'm not sure globally, but certainly across Europe, the difficulty that Green parties have had is their core campaign strategy has largely been adopted by every other political party. Apart from, say, right and far right parties, the kind of philosophy of net zero, of green transition, of renewables, of sustainable living, you'd be hard pressed to find a centre or centre left or left wing party in Europe that didn't align with those values. Which then begs the question, what does the Green Party then stand for? Specifically in the UK, but in Europe more generally, what does the Green movement stand for? And that is when the principles of, say, equality, of socialism, of redistribution of wealth come in, because you can't just... You're now at the point where you can't idealistically say we should have more cycle paths, or we should have more offshore wind, or we should have solar panels on new built homes, right? You need to then come to a point of, well, how are we going to do this? What does that world look like where we have this kind of this massive transition in society? Because it is like what we need to do is on par with, say, like post-war Britain. You know, the transition that's needed is humongous. And I guess a year before Labour got in, they had the appearance that they were going to do something radical with GB Energy, right? With the 28 billion annually that they were going to be putting into it as a national green energy, like a green energy construction, production, and distribution power. It's now really just an umbrella company for existing companies to get funding off of to put.
It's just a rebrand.
But like at the time, a year ago, 2 years ago, it was seen as this radical transition into like, is that something that the Green Party could be pushing them more on? Maybe. Is it something that's going to get them cut through in the local elections? Maybe not. I think more material, tangible politics is what green movements in general need to be going for.
Yes, and I think that is what certain factions of the green movement are trying to do just now, is to change this into a more material issue. And the thing that they are saying that separates them from the Labour Party is their full throttle backing of a wealth tax. And that's a very popular thing. And interestingly, in Kent, on the doors, it's actually a very reform area. And they're saying that when they're not door knocking and they're finding people that do vote reform, they're asking them, well, you know, why are you voting reform? And it's not that they're super pro reform policies, but that they want an alternative to Labour and the Conservatives. And that actually, when they hear things about a wealth tax, that actually plays quite well. Like, it does play well with the country as a whole, according to polling. But I think one of the issues that they do have is they have the same amount of MPs as Reform, but if you look at how much media time is dedicated to the two, it's so vastly different.
It's the leadership factor.
Yeah, it's like the charisma factor.
Yeah.
And over half of Green voters in 2024 didn't know who Carla Denyer is. Ask people in this country if they know who Nigel Farage is, and even people that don't vote Reform know who he is. Like he's probably
people who don't vote know who he is.
Exactly. He's so well known, and kind of what his rhetoric is so well known, that ultimately I think there's this missing charisma factor to the Greens if they actually do want to be seen. I mean, charisma and charismatic leadership is pretty integral to populism. And if you've seen where the left have done quite well in Europe, or even in the US, like with people like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, and then in France you've got people like Mélenchon. Where the left does well is when they have these charismatic leaders in charge. Even in the UK, if you consider Mick Lynch to be like a trade union leftist, that his style of like how he appears on TV and how he engages with the media made him incredibly popular.
Yeah.
And that is the missing factor that the Greens seem to have in this country right now, is that front-facing leader of the movement that people can identify with and that people think is cool.
Yeah, it's too polished. I mean, that's not to say that Nigel Farage is cool, but he certainly comes across as human.
Well,
you know?
He said on Laura Kuenssberg, he said, young people think that we are the coolest party.
Okay. I mean, but look, I mean, during the election, they were certainly the most attuned to how people consume social media. I think the thing that, and still actually, what the Labour Party in particular, and also the Conservatives kind of miss out on a lot, particularly when it comes to TikTok, is how young people actually consume politics on TikTok. And this idea that everything is a meme and everything is so patronizing to anyone under 30, anyone under young people like me. It's such a patronizing way to go about politics. Like if you look back to, say, the years like the Obama years or the Corbyn years, where Facebook was a big driver of what the of what political movements were, it wasn't this kind of, oh, we need to dumb things down for you because you're a fucking idiot and you can't understand basic economic policy or basic social policy. We need to make this out as though it's for a dummy. There was inspiration behind movements like the Obama movement or the Corbyn movement. I mean, I recognize that there's a lot of time in between those two movements, but still. And Reform during the election, we're just putting up videos of Nigel Farage speaking.
Yep.
Simply just him speaking. And it wasn't even like, it didn't look too polished. It didn't look, some of them weren't even in the right format for TikTok. But with hundreds of thousands of views, sometimes millions of views. And And the memes of it would be things that had nothing to do with politics. Like, you know, that, what is it? Those are juicy melons or something like that when he's in the supermarket.
But also, I think like the key thing is these memes aren't coming necessarily from the Reform Party central office.
Yes.
Like they're putting out the raw footage of Farage talking, Farage at the pub, whatever. And then it's people online. It's a natural thing that comes from that.
Yeah.
And partly because of Farage's personality and how he does appear on camera. And that seems to be what Labour are, like Labour are trying to make the memes themselves and putting it on their Instagram, which just isn't the same thing.
I mean, you know, the whole JD Vance meme, like as soon as he started posting the memes himself, it was done.
Yeah.
You know, like it's the same with everything. That once there is a self-awareness of the joke, the joke is done. You can't be the party of government and try and get in on things like this. Because some of them don't even make sense, the things that the Labour Party post online. But no, I think when it comes to populism in general, yes, absolutely, you need to have a charismatic leader. But I think moreover, you need to have a leader that can speak the language of the people.
Yes.
Can, like, whether it was Mick Lynch, right?
Yeah.
A lot of what people identified with him was that he wasn't, particularly in his media appearances very early on. Yeah, he wasn't playing it whatsoever. He wasn't allowing himself to get backed into a corner. He wasn't
giving a politician's answer to
exactly.
questions.
But in many ways, Nigel Farage does that. You know, every couple of days you will see a clip of him from whether it's Sky or BBC or something, where quite legitimately someone will ask him a question about, I don't know, Rupert Lowe or about aligning with Elon Musk or I don't know, something abominable in the local politics of the Reform Party. And he will just turn back around and start shouting at them or walk away and have this kind of, and obviously it doesn't particularly appeal to me, that as a response, but you can see where somebody would feel that would appeal to them, of not being spoken down to by a London upper class media elite, you know. And yeah, the Green Party do have that kind of that to reckon with, of either you transform the way your leaders operate with the media or you just melt into the background.
I don't think the Greens have the luxury of having a Starmer-esque, Rishi Sunak-esque leader. Only the two major parties in this country can have bureaucratic, technocratic, boring leaders, like
because they're guaranteed a voter base.
Exactly. Whereas I think if you are a breakthrough party, you can't engage in that form of politics. You have to do something different and it's why the Lib Dems have since the election have fallen into total irrelevancy, because they are engaging in that traditional British party politics. But it's why Reform continue to grab so much media attention, is because they're actually not playing that game. They're fiery. And they're not nice. And maybe the Greens are just too nice.
Yeah.
And they need to realise that they're playing a different game.
Yeah, the Lib Dem point is actually a good one. I think a lot of what they're lacking at the moment is this kind of, because I mean, during the campaign, right, you had this attempt to make Ed Davey the meme candidate, which to some extent he was.
Yeah.
Right? They're slowly starting to go back into that. Like I saw over the weekend, not often, dear listener, do I use YouTube Shorts, but I was on YouTube Shorts over the weekend, and I saw a post by the Lib Dems of Ed Davey in Scotland on the campaign trail. Did you see this? Where it was like he had chicken and he had, I think it was toffee from Scotland, and it was about this Buy British thing. But whatever the music bed of the video is, I'm describing this so poorly.
No.
Because I can't remember what the music was. I can't remember what the products were that he was touting. Anyway, whatever the music bed was, he was dancing to the music bed.
Yeah, I feel like I have seen this video.
Deeply embarrassing stuff.
Yes.
And it is kind of just taking what worked or kind of worked during the election.
Yeah.
But did it work? Could you go out? Could you leave this studio now and ask any person on the street what the Lib Dems stand for?
No, I think everyone just saw pictures of Ed Davey on teacups and
Yeah.
And to be fair, during a general election, it was an effective campaign strategy. Whenever Ed Davey did a stunt, you could guarantee that there would be media there filming it.
Yeah.
And they would then ask him a policy question after the stunt. But I think the difference is we're not in a general election anymore. Why are you still engaging in that form of communication?
Yeah.
You need to change it now. Like, we're in it's a different government now. Change your comms.
To go back to ever so slightly to the British Steel conversation, and related to the Lib Dems, during the debate on Saturday, you kind of had this distillation of kind of where the Lib Dems are at the moment. Like, I mean, you see it every week at PMQs as well, of Ed Davey's questions veer between something to do with Trump and something to do with the care sector, which, don't get me wrong, care in the UK is an urgent problem, needs a spokesperson for it, and no one better than Ed Davey, who has direct experience with it.
He's a good spokesperson for the care system.
However, there is a little bit of it feels a little bit FBP to, in the debate about British Steel, to be talking about the Conservatives, to be talking about Trump, to be talking about things like that, when there is a far more pressing issue at hand, right? Now, obviously, they're in some way related, but I think there was a really good. I just thought it was quite an interesting interjection by Edward Lee during the debate, where he was kind of, actually, can we just listen to it?
Yes.
Yep.
We can be party political. I have to say, I thought the Chairman of the Business Committee made an excellent speech just now. He was positive. He talked in strategic terms. I don't know what the Liberal Democrat spokesman achieved by constantly attacking the Conservative Party in what is a very complex issue. Of course, we can be criticised because we sold this company to Jingay. Yes, I agree. But how many voices over there were speaking up at the time? And were they speaking up when Greg Clark, our business secretary, paid the wages of the Scunthorpe steel workers for many months? Were they speaking up when we saved Sheffield Forge Masters? This is a highly complex issue, and we should be working together. So I support this bill. Now, I know that we can be critical of the government. Perhaps we should have acted sooner. And my honourable friend has been raising this point. I was sitting beside him when he raised it at the end of March, and he called for nationalisation of this industry. But we've now got to work together to save our steel-making capacity.
I am extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. I would just like to ask him to clarify whether he was aware that the Chinese company that is now in possession of British Steel was actually sold it by a Conservative government of which he was a part.
Well, of course I'm aware, because I've just said it. I've just admitted that it was a mistake, but I've asked everybody here, what were they saying at the time? Of course, silence. Silence. It's easy to be wise after the event, but I'm worried about my steel workers. I'm worried about their future.
So Edward Lee basically saying we fucked up, but also making the point that every interjection in the debate has been from the Lib Dems had been about how much the Conservatives had fucked it up. And him saying, okay, here I am, somebody who voted for this at the time. What would you like to do about it?
Yeah.
You know? And I do think that's actually, that kind of distills where a lot of people are with the Lib Dems, is that, particularly when it comes to PMQs, you've got this thing of like, you can nearly guarantee that it's going to be, will the Prime Minister agree with me that Donald Trump is a dickhead? You know? Like,
yeah.
Cool. Like you've wasted 4 minutes.
Yes.
You know, you're guaranteed 4 minutes every single week, and you're hoping that, I feel like the audience for that kind of thing starts and ends at somebody who traditionally votes Lib Dem. Like, you're not growing yourself anymore, you know. And look, who's to say how they're going to do in the locals? But I think it just doesn't feel like there's much of a point of difference, especially in a debate like that. You're kind of thinking, okay, this is an opportunity for the third party to separate themselves out from the two big beasts. And in attacking one of the big beasts, you're kind of just aligning yourself with the other one.
Definitely.
So it's a coalition by default then at that point, right?
I think about the local elections, I'm breaking through to go back to the Greens. And that's the other thing I think that they desperately need to shake off is the NIMBYism. As in, they're very much viewed as a party that's going to block building. And I think right now, that's not where the British, that's not where the British mainstream voter is. They're at a place where they want house building, they want infrastructure building. And I think any party that's seen as opposing that is quite inherently negative to the average British voter.
It's funny how all of them, it's quite poetic in a way, isn't it? That all of the smaller parties have an Achilles heel. Whether it's the NIMBYism of the Greens, whether it's the pseudo-fascism of the Reform Party.
Quite different Achilles heels, to be fair.
No.
One party is a guy that said Hitler had made some good points, and the others are blocking a house being built.
I would put them in the same bracket, actually. And a dancing leader as your Achilles heel for the Lib Dems.
Is that a good place to end this?
I think so. We've given them a lot to mull over on this Monday.
Yeah. Let us know what you thought about that.
Yeah. See you in the Reddit.
See ya.
The little wave.
Embarrassed, cut that out.
I'm going to punch right in on that.
Cut it
like
out.
fucking super zoom. Excellent. How is that all?